Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Getting More Value Out of Content, being presented by iKnow's Engagement Directors, Dr. Simon Trussler and Robert Armacost. As the foremost authority in benchmarking best practices and process improvement and knowledge management, APQC is pleased to bring you stories from leading-edge organizations like iKnow LLC. iKnow was the exclusive sponsor of APQC's 2018 Knowledge Management Conference that happened back in April. And this presentation was one of the highest rated from the conference. Before we get started, just a few things to keep in mind. You can tweet about today's webinar using the hashtag KMAPQC. All lines are in listen-only mode, but feel free to enter your questions at any time in the Q&A window to the right of your screen. We will address as many questions as possible. You will also receive a follow-up email no later than this coming Monday with slides and the full recording from today's webinar. And now I'd like to welcome today's speakers, Dr. Simon Trussler and Mr. Robert Armacost. Both serve as engagement directors for iKnow LLC with extensive consulting experience in all aspects of knowledge management. We are so glad to have you both here today. And now, Simon, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Zakia. It's a pleasure to be talking with you today. And as Zakia mentioned, the subject is getting more value out of content and some particular tools that might help you to do that. We all know that making the most of content is one of the key issues for KM groups today. It's gotten much easier to capture content with all of the document management and storage tools we have at our disposal, but the challenge continues to be curation, quality management, findability, actually getting value out of all of that content that we're capturing. Now, we believe that tagging of content or classifying content is fundamental to doing that. But as we all know, manual classification is the KM task that everybody hates to do. As Carla Odell said at the recent APQC conference, it's the most thankless task in all of knowledge management. So anything that makes that easier should be very welcome. So Bob's going to tell us a little bit about why we think auto-classification is worthwhile and a good solution to this. And then I'll come along and talk about how to put it into practice and some of the challenges and opportunities that you need to be aware of. So I'll hand over to Bob for the first section.
Great. Thank you very much, Simon. And it's great to have a chance to speak with all of you about this really critical topic in knowledge management, which is how to get the most value out of content. And what I'm going to do is just provide an introduction to help frame the problem and give an introduction to the whole topic of auto classification, some of the basic vocabulary, the business benefits, and how it's different. And the whole conversation begins with what we think of is the runaway train of content overload. As Simon mentioned, organizations are these days inundated with vast stores of content and information, well beyond what existed previously. And this includes everything from thought leadership to policies, procedures, methodologies, analytic tools, examples, reference materials, third-party research, databases, and so forth. And the big challenge that organizations have is helping to bring all that together and make sense of it so that the organization and the people can actually find what they need, benefit, use it appropriately, and the organization can benefit from it. And one of the reasons this is getting so much more difficult for organizations is the ease in creation and also the ease in storing content in public places, contributed by a number of the cloud-hosted storage solutions that so many organizations have. And so let's talk a little bit about what's contributing to that and the issues it's creating. So we go to the next slide. Again, it just emphasizes the big challenges we're facing in the explosion of content. And it is going to get worse. It is getting worse every day in organizations. And the biggest challenge is that our people expect to be able to find what they need when they need it quickly. And also, given that the majority of organizations are now being increasingly run and managed by digital natives, and that trend will continue to take place. There's an expectation level contributed by Google and other publicly available tools as well, that people should be able to find everything in just a few clicks. Now, part of the reality, unfortunately, if we move to the next slide, is that within enterprises and within an organization, across all the content they create, the various databases they have, organizations frequently don't deliver that very well. And in fact, when you go to organizations, it almost seems like nearly everybody in every organization hates their enterprise search. This is not 100%, but it's pretty common. And there's two things that we hear frequently from people we speak with in organizations. The first is that for published content that an organization may have put on their public website, but they've created internally, it's branded high value content. People tell us they in many organizations that they prefer just to go to the public Google search engine to find the organization's own content, because they can't find any of it either using their internal search or using the search on their website. And we hear this over and over. It's just easier to find stuff on Google. A second thing that we hear is for internal documents, because of the frustrations that people have in finding what they need, is they end up relying very heavily on 1980s technology, which is email, where they'll find a person that they think was the author of a document. They'll email them and ask for the document, and then the person will send it from their hard drive on their computer, even though this is something where there may have been significant efforts to kind of capture and tag and upload that same document into the internal search engine. People can't find it. So they're still relying on email. And this is a pattern that exists in organization after organization. And the solution's not easy. For one, it's not as easy as just bringing Google into an enterprise. And for those of you who do have experience with intranets and with enterprise search, you'll know that the Google search appliance was never set up to really search enterprise content inside an intranet. When you buy that, you don't buy the power of the public Google search engine. You buy basically a very basic text search utility, which works fine. But when you have very rich content on very deep and technical topics, it's not going to have the intelligence to know what to bring up first and what's the most important. And moreover, the Google search appliance is being retired this year, as many of you know. Same thing with SharePoint. I mean, SharePoint is used in many, many enterprises, and that search is also limited, and in most organizations it's not tuned properly. So it's, even when content is tagged, often the SharePoint search isn't tuned properly to take advantage of the metadata tags. And all of these issues are compounded by the fact that organizations have multiple repositories and systems with content stored in different places, with different tagging approaches, and the expectation of users is to bring all of these together seamlessly when people need it, to create an integrated view of what they know, particularly on very narrow and specific topics. And so this is a big challenge that we're all dealing with. I think the related element of the challenge is the trade-off that every organization needs to deal with. Because in a perfect world, what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to provide people very easy real-time access to information. We call that reach, one-click access to everything that you might want. But at the same time, people also want to have richness, so in-depth knowledge, and this would involve deep context around a particular type of information, making sure it's the highest value and most important stuff. The ability to discover things that maybe you didn't know by linking what might be about that information to something else. And historically, there's a trade-off between these two. If you want to be able to deliver very easy reach and broad reach, you often have to sacrifice the richness because the effort to sort of translate that richness or in-depth knowledge involves a lot of effort that often only comes in the form of in-person, one-on-one interchanges. So typically, the compromise is that if people are looking for very rich knowledge, they've got to find the person that wrote it and speak to them and then get the information from them. And what we're talking about here, and the goal that we should all be striving for, is to move the curve up to the right. So really get to a new reality where there's the ability to get rich content and discovery all of the time, so that users are finding what they need in a manageable format and in a manageable manner. But do that in just a few clicks. So the good news is that there's technology that exists in the marketplace designed to help do this, to help improve that enterprise search challenge that we just talked about, and also help move that curve between that trade-off between richness and reach up to the right. And we call that cognitive computing. These are tools that recognize and extract content themes and do that using machine algorithms that have been trained by people, and then route that content to the right people in context. And cognitive computing is a very broad umbrella term that involves text analytics. It involves machine learning and having software do what people have historically done. It involves workflow automation, robotic process automation. A lot of different elements get thrown into this cognitive computing bucket. The challenge in most enterprises is there's so much there and so many things to tackle and so many different kinds of tools that in most enterprises, we're seeing them really spinning their wheels and having a big challenge in really adopting high value applications of cognitive computing. And that's because they're costly, they're complex, and again, in many organizations, they remain elusive. And what we want to talk about today is one piece of that, which is auto classification. This is an important enabler to everything else that somebody might be thinking about doing. Think of this as the core building block of findability and discovery of information. And we're going to spend some time talking about that today. So what is auto classification and what does this mean? It starts with building an effective taxonomy, and we'll talk in a minute about why we believe taxonomies are still very, very important, in fact, mission critical to success in enterprise findability. And that taxonomy is something that is used so that you can classify information against that taxonomy, and having technology to help recognize the content that is in the information or in the documents, and then automatically classifying the documents to keywords in that taxonomy, and then linking all of that together so that you can discover. And when we talk about taxonomy, there's also a word called an ontology. And what this is think of that as a taxonomy on steroids, where you're creating lists and lists of different types of keywords in a structured manner, but having the ability to link related concepts together, to use the power of all of that knowledge and the content that's in the document to help people find and discover information more quickly. And a great example of this, if you just think of the term blockchain. Blockchain, as you know, is a very significant and emerging capability and technology that has been built that supports a number of different uses in financial services and cryptocurrency and so forth. And if you think of the word blockchain, that has linkages and references to many, many different kinds of things, including different industries, different technology types, and so forth. And a good ontology might take these various lists and help people link all of those concepts together. And we're going to actually do a live example in healthcare a little bit later in this presentation to bring that to life. So that's a basic definition of auto classification. Now, I talked before about how we believe that taxonomy is still mission critical in that it remains the fundamental building block of content curation and findability, and we believe that it is. And what taxonomy essentially is to an organization, it's a common language for key concepts that matter to the people and to the business in that organization. And it's the way people work and think. And having that is very, very critical. It not only enhances communications across an organization, but with respect to our conversation here, is it can help greatly improve search precision and consistency. And in addition to that, helping people to discover content. So information that they may not have thought of, but that can be pushed or delivered to them. And the taxonomy is the building block that sits behind that. So back to our ontology example, I talked about blockchain before. Here's an example on the public internet of how a taxonomy and an ontology of related concepts can be brought together in a real-world application. And this actually is a page from Wikipedia. This is what comes up when somebody searches for the city Houston in Wikipedia. And what's interesting here is that the Wikipedia page brings a whole set of structured and related content of different types alongside that link or that description about the city of Houston. So this is taking information about Houston that is actually very important concepts and terms that relate to other things as well. And you can see countries, counties, states, land area, different government types, etc. And having an ontology behind this enables a user to click and discover other types of things that they weren't necessarily searching for. And this is a big benefit in enterprises, is having those relationships. And the technology we're talking about here today can help put that in place for you. So what's different about auto classification? I described a minute ago the three components of it. Let me contrast it, the kind of traditional manual approach with the automated approach before we go into more detail with Simon. The manual approach, when we think about it, the concept, the process of building a taxonomy, which is what are we going to call things, is often quite limited in many organizations, because the scope and depth of it is often going to be limited by the tagging workload and also the setup of the content management tools that exist. And in many organizations, we end up having only very high-level categories for browsing, not a lot of depth or complexity. And when we think about tagging documents to that taxonomy, what are the rules and how does it work? You often have either end users tagging things when they upload it, or you might have a small central team of people who would have some information background, but they don't have subject matter expertise in all of the technical topics. So what happens is you end up hitting tags that often are of very questionable quality, and in many organizations, documents without tags at all. And that's the reality, and that's one of the root causes of those search issues we talked about earlier. In the automated world, I think the contrast is that this can enable a much, much deeper set of terms and keywords with alternative terms, synonyms, lateral relationships, and so forth. And all of this can help be kind of expanded and enhanced through the text analytics and the underlying tools that we're going to talk about today. And in addition to that, the tagging of documents is done based on programmed rules, based on where content and text occurs in the document, its frequency, and a lot of other positive and negative restrictions. And this can enable a much, much higher quality ability to find what you need, drill down on it, and trust what you're getting. And this is, I think, the power of what we're talking about today. So what are the benefits if we just sort of step back? First and foremost, it's about cost and quality. So even though there is some time and money associated with putting the tools, these tools that we're going to talk about today, in place, the ongoing improvement in day-to-day kind of cost and efficiency is dramatic. There's a dramatic takeout of people and labor, particularly very, very high-value subject matter experts around an organization that can now have 80% or more of the effort done by technology. And along with that is improved quality based on the examples that I just talked about. A second big benefit is about curation and records management. Because once there is a much higher quality ability to find content, it exposes what exists in the enterprise. It enables you to both promote the best stuff, but also get rid of what we call the ROT, ROT. This stands for redundant, outdated, or trivial. And we see organizations, when they adopt tools like this, they can often reduce the size of their content store by 50% or more by just having a higher quality ability to spot what's out there. And that's a big, big benefit. Content discovery and integration, also a big benefit. Again, leveraging the ontology that we talked about and the ability to link topics from kind of one area to another, and do that across different data sources and repositories, which again this technology can kind of help bring together much more effectively. And then ultimately, this is about improving findability and search, so that you can what comes up is more relevant. You can drill down on what you need, and you can browse more effectively into related topics. So this is really exciting. And with that intro, I'm going to turn it back to Simon, who's going to spend some time digging into the actual tools themselves and some best practices. So over to you, Simon.
Yes, thanks, Bob. Let's look at a couple of examples that illustrate the benefits that Bob was talking about, and then we'll look at what it takes to make it happen. First one here is just about handling huge volumes of content in a way that improves findability and just manageability of that content base. This is an example of an electric power utility with many facilities and locations and over 1 million documents across their intranet and records management systems, and that's growing all the time. And they're simply overwhelmed by this. It's grown over 30 or 40 years. It's going to continue to grow. And how do you, in that situation, get a grip on this content, make it easy to navigate and easy to find? Well, one way in is to classify it, as we've talked about. And the interesting thing here is when you just classify this by 5 main facets, and you see them here: business areas, equipment types, locations, types of content, document types, if you like, and partner and external relationships. These kind of map onto some of the key use cases that people would have when searching this repository. And just by doing this, by classifying in this way, you can rapidly narrow down the scope of a search. So from going to millions of documents, if you just were to do a free text search across the whole intranet, refining it down by one or more of these facets rapidly cuts that into the thousands and then the hundreds and then hopefully the dozens or tens, enable you to find things more easily just by narrowing down by multiple dimensions. So it helps you understand that. And then as another benefit, as Bob was mentioning, doing this enables you to understand better what content you have, because you're looking in smaller buckets once you've classified things, and you can start to curate things better then. And we've seen that in many situations, the value of classification as a prelude to curation. And finally, you can leverage that taxonomy for useful business applications. So you could look, in this case, they were interested in a better search of policies and procedures, which is a document type, but also relates to business areas and technical standards. So by leveraging that classification and those facets, you can get to a much tighter a more useful search of policies and procedures that is helpful to people in operational areas. So that's just making sense of a large repository. The other thing Bob mentioned was actually combining structured and unstructured data to create more value. And here's an example that's provided by Smart Logic, which is one of the vendors in the auto classification space. I think this is based on work they did with the NHS in England. And it's about predicting full risk of falling over, especially for senior patients and people in care homes or people living at home who are a bit older and more frail. And this is actually the key thing for health services, not just there, but globally, because falls typically correlate with all kinds of complications, hospitalization risk, emergency room risk, and they make they're both made worse and they make worse the chronic conditions that many of these people suffer from. So any way of using data and analysis to predict this is very helpful. And typically this is a combination of structured data. So you have data from the electronic health record that gives you some ideas about vulnerability based on the drugs that people are taking, possible side effects of those, effects on balance and so on. But then combining that with unstructured data from text sources like visiting nurse reports or social worker notes, an example here of uneven carpet in the person's house. These are all different kinds of risks that can't necessarily be quantified, but come out clearly by text analyzing the notes. So having a taxonomy that combines those in the way you're seeing up here, different kinds of risk factors essentially, it enables you to make sense of all of this data and text sources to create something much bigger. And there's lots of examples of this. We have another example we sometimes talk about on auto repairs, where you're combining data about common maintenance issues in cars with text reports of repairs that were done and the effect of things like climate and age of car and so on. So there are other examples of this, and you can probably think of many others where you can combine textual sources with data to produce some more insight. So those are a couple of examples. And why, if they're so good, why isn't everybody doing this? And I think there are several reasons. One of them is just reputation. And if you look at one of the latest Gartner reports, they have their technology hype cycle, where they look at how different technologies are moving on the life cycle from early adoption to more adoption to perhaps falling out of favor. And they put enterprise taxonomy and ontology on the sliding side of the curve here, so it's going out of favor in their view. Based on our discussions with clients and around the industry, we somewhat disagree with that assessment. I think probably where it comes from is the implementation challenges that people have had, and Gartner are giving a high weighting on that cost and implementation effort. We think that's maybe partly an aspect of expectation setting. We're going to talk about what it takes in a minute, and it does take quite a bit of effort and so on. If you're aware of that going in and you go in with your eyes open, it's probably a much better starting point, and you would be less inclined to take this view. There are, of course, important factors like the economics of doing it. It's not cheap technology, and it will only make sense if you have quite a large number of documents or a large number of people to manage in terms of potential taggers and classifiers. And we generally look at about 50,000 documents as the threshold, somewhere around that level. If you've got that amount across all of your repositories in your organization, then it's definitely going to be worth thinking about this. Any less than that, and it may be a little expensive at this stage of the life cycle. Although there are technologies changing all the time, and costs will come down for this. So bearing in mind the costs and the challenges, that they do pose some barriers that we'll talk about, but we think more people should be doing it, and it's wrong to take a negative view of this. So what are those challenges, and how can we anticipate and deal with them? Well, here's a kind of a life cycle of a auto classification project and what to expect along the way, and some of the factors in the boxes down below here. We'll go through each of these in turn during the remainder of this presentation. So you obviously have to start off with the taxonomy, as Bob mentioned. That's the fundamental building block, and the taxonomy development is the key piece to get started with, and getting that right is mission critical for the whole thing. Then you move into the classification, the auto classification, so building the rules to do that and making sure they work into the testing phase, making sure they work across the whole corpus of content that you're dealing with. And then finally thinking about governance. How do you keep all that going in the future, make it flexible and adaptable as your business changes? We should talk about taxonomy development. Doesn't happen on its own. It's a major task. We'll talk about how to embark on that. The taxonomy may be larger than you think, and that poses its own challenges, but also benefits. Classification rules will typically require iterative development, and it's not a one-shot deal. You'll have to do this a couple of times to get it right. And technically, the classification runs when you actually set the engine to work on your content. That may be time-consuming, and that needs to be planned for too. And then finally, you will need active, ongoing governance to keep this fresh, and because business concepts change and ways of classifying change, so you need to be on top of that for the whole thing to retain its credibility within your organization. So let's start with taxonomy development, and that, as you know, requires investment, especially if you're starting from scratch. But even if you're working from an existing taxonomy, it may not be suited to auto classification. So you need to review it and make sure it's really tightly designed and has terms that can be compared with content and auto classified properly. We'll get into that in a second. There are lots of sources for doing this. On the left of the slide, you can look at existing systems and taxonomy systems. You can even look at existing filing systems. And commonly, even if you don't have an enterprise taxonomy, you'll have a folder structure in SharePoint or even a manual filing system that offers clues as to how people think about content and maybe building blocks for a future taxonomy. A second important source is search logs. What do people actually search for today, and how successful are they at doing those searches? That'll give you a clue as to use cases and concepts that people need to be able to access easily, so they should be in external models. From one source, and these can save you doing some work, especially in technical areas that people have, often research institutes or other academic organizations have created ontologies for particular technical areas that can be very helpful. And then finally, Bob alluded to this earlier, the concept mining and text mining. So the bottoms-up approach, where you can, most of these auto classification tools have a text mining element where they can, instead of working off an existing taxonomy, they can look at a set of content and analyze it and give you concepts that are prominent in that content. So again, like the search log, it would give you some clue as to what might be important to highlight in your taxonomy. So lots of groundwork there, and then obviously there's a human judgment of what's important from all of that, what should be the key facets and the top levels of the taxonomy hierarchy. And that's going to require review by subject matter experts or SMEs within your organization, and probably a couple of iterations of that. And finally, business buy-in, which will be aided by the fact you've had the SMEs involved, but ultimately you need the business to agree to and support the taxonomy so they believe it'll be useful for the business cases that are important. So open source ontologies, as we mentioned, can be helpful. Here's an example of one for clean energy, and they have a climate smart thesaurus here, which includes lots of terms related to alternative energy sources and climate change. It's multi-language, it's multi-sector, it has tagging tools like the climate tagger they mention down below. And it's a linked open data set, which means that it can be linked to your own ontology and complement your internal terms. So this may not be your area, but there are ones for many different technical areas or other areas, and it's worth doing some web searches to find out if there are ones that could benefit your organization to give you a kind of a head start. These things will also include lots of links to synonyms, acronyms, and related terms, which again save you a lot of trouble, because those alternative terms, as we'll see in a second, are very important to accurate classification. We mentioned taxonomy will probably be deeper than you think, and with manual tagging, you're often a bit limited just by the resources you have available and the types of people who might be working with it. So you'll often just go down 2 or 3 levels, which is good for bucketing content in the right general area, but you'll miss things as well, and it's not very specific. So it'll be quick to tag and easy to browse, but it won't get you to very specific concepts that you may want to be able to find. On the right, with auto tagging, we can see we can dig a bit deeper here. If we're looking for different kinds of benefits plans, you might do a text search for 401k plans, but you might miss then documents about retirement plans in general, or about 457 plans, which are a relative of 401ks. You might miss a lot of related content, and that will then not roll up correctly into the benefits category. If you have a properly structured ontology with all of these alternative terms in there, you'll both get more evidence for tagging content, because you'll be looking at alternative forms of the words, and things will roll up correctly. So benefits will include really everything that relates to benefits, and not just things that actually mention benefits in the title. So it'll create more evidence for auto tagging. There's lots of examples of this. I took the example of health insurance, health plans, medical insurance, lots of different ways of phrasing that. And you want to make sure those are in your ontology, so all of those things are picked up accurately. So you might end up going deeper, but there's a big benefit to doing that in terms of accuracy, precision, and flexibility of searching. So how all this works, to take this example of an EAP, or an employee assistance program, as part of a benefits taxonomy under human resources in this example. And we can see that the preferred label, what we want to call it in the taxonomy, is EAP. The client here wanted to call it EAP because that's what it's called internally. They didn't want to necessarily spell the whole thing out. But obviously, if you do that, you do need to spell out the synonyms. So down the bottom, you see the synonyms are employee assistance and employee assistance programs. So we capture all of those concepts in addition to the acronym. We also have to watch out that we don't accidentally classify other things that are not relevant, because in this organization, there are emergency action plans and there are expenditure authorization procedures, both of which sometimes use the EAP acronym. So we've put those in as negative evidence, so the auto classification engine can ignore materials that include those concepts and just do stuff that's really related to employee assistance. Finally, here we've got some required site and SharePoint links, and these just restrict the classification to content from those areas. You may or may not want to do that, depending how much you trust your current SharePoint site organization and classification. But if you believe you've done some work on that and that's a good basis for classification, then why not use that as well and use some of the categorization that's already been done. And the same here with the open text content server records management system that has its own classification for this concept. So putting all that together, you can get pretty accurate classification of content relating to EAPs in this organization using that variety of alternative labels. And you put that together with the rules that you develop. And looking at this slide from the bottom up, you'd start off with the negative rules. So do not tag this document with EAP if the emergency assistance program language or the expenditure authorization language is found in there. So those are kind of the dropout criteria that start off. Then for the remainder, let's look at the title and the body of the document, and there'll be a number of rules typically in terms of how seriously you treat mention of the concept or any of its synonyms or acronyms in the title and the body. Typically you weight the title higher than the body, but often there's some experimentation with these weightings to get the right degree of sensitivity with the auto-classification. Also, part of the secret sauce of these tools is variant generation. So the tools will auto-generate lots of textual variants of the terms you're talking about, and you'll want to weight those in different ways with your rules as well. So singulars, plurals, capitalization, abbreviations, and things like that. So that the blue things here are all of the text-based, content-based rules. And then you add on to those any metadata rules you have about how much you want to weight where things are in existing folders or sites. And finally, relationship rules. Do you want to tag the parent term 100% of the time or only some of the time when you're looking at classifying a child term? And then how about related terms? Do you want to give any weight to mention of related terms or not? So all of those things go together and roll up to produce the final rules. And what typically happens is you get scores on each of those rules down below. You combine them all together to create a final score. And then the threshold there, there's a threshold that determines whether that final score creates a tag or not. So that's how it's done, and you'll understand that you can start with some templates for that, but there's some work to do in developing those rules. And then, whoops. Hit the wrong key. In developing those rules, that there'll be an iteration required. Typically, you'll start off with a simulated classification. So you'll take a set of documents, a small set of documents, run the rules against them, have some subject matter experts review them, and see how that works. Then you'll fine-tune those rules based on that review, probably add more evidence terms, more synonyms and acronyms, even some more negative evidence. And then you'll run the full classification. And typically it won't be right first time. You'll either have some over-tagging, you'll have too many tags that are not necessarily relevant. You might have some under-tagging, things that get missed. And through all of that, you'll be experimenting with the title and body weightings that we talked about to see how sensitive your classification engine should be. There are good solutions to all of these things. With the over-tagging, you're often using words that are too common, and you'll want to make those words more specific or add qualifiers to them. Or you might want to add more restrictions and negative evidence. With under-tagging, you've not picked up something that you should have picked up, and that's normally a question of lacking some synonyms or acronyms or metadata. So you'll want to look again and see if you've looked at all the different ways that concept could be phrased. And then we talked about the title and body weightings and how you might look at those. So usually a couple of iterations when you run those rules, reclassify, and then review them. The classification process itself might be quite time intensive. There's a couple of ways of approaching this. You could classify purely during the indexing to, for instance, to a SharePoint search index. So you could just add the tags as content goes into that search index, along with all the other stuff that SharePoint collects. That's simple and quick, but it doesn't affect the underlying content, so it's only useful for the search itself. It's not added back, the classification is not added back to the source document, so you can't leverage it in any other way that you might want to outside of search. If you actually write back these tags to the underlying repositories, there are many benefits. You could do more structured browsing of the content. You could add other applications that use the same tags, or you could add just other UI features that, that rely on tagging. It's a bit more complex to build and manage, but in general, we feel it's worth the effort. It gives this additional flexibility. It adds value to your underlying repositories and makes the whole thing more useful. But the classification process does take time. We have a kind of a benchmark with an average size system of about 20,000 documents per hour. So depending how many you have, that could add some time, and you need to plan those updates carefully. You typically do this on a segregated server environment, so it doesn't affect your ongoing operational systems, but it still takes time to monitor it and to monitor those servers and that operation. So it's not a trivial thing to think about. So all of that implies strong governance. You're going to need ongoing monitoring of how the business is changing and how the search is performing. So you'll want to set up user feedback. You'll want to do ongoing reviews of search logs to see how people's searches are succeeding or not succeeding today and how much the taxonomy is helping with that. And you'll want to look at tag frequency as well. Are there some terms in your taxonomy that just aren't getting classified very much? Maybe they're phrased wrongly, or maybe they're just not very relevant to your taxonomy and they could be cleaned out. So thinking about that's important, and that will typically lead to a set of suggested changes to the taxonomy and the rules. And you can build that into a reclassification schedule and scope how broadly you want to go across the content in terms of reclassifying things. Often a 6-monthly or maybe a quarterly if you have a very active changing business. That kind of cycle would work well for this in terms of monitoring and potentially reclassifying. And then in terms of the role of the KM group and the KM department, think about the enhanced staff roles that this could create, the opportunities that this creates. Clearly, if you're classifying better, you can curate better. We talked about that right up the front. What's the best content in each category from what's been classified? And curation, even if it wasn't already, becomes a key element of your KM roles. You can also push content more effectively. If it's being classified better, then the push of content to people as and when they need it would be more accurate and more powerful. So thinking about that, about how to add value to people by pushing them content at the time they need it, for instance, at the startup of a project based on the topics that project is about, would be very important. Enriching the knowledge, what related knowledge is relevant to a concept, and how can we take a broader view of search and content discovery. That would be important in terms of future ontology development. And then related to that, linking to external ontologies like we talked about to improve the structure and the coverage of a taxonomy. So finally, how do you plan all of this? Firstly, as we talked about the is it worth it question, there's a business case to create. So what is the volume of content you want to classify? How many people do you have working on tagging today? And what are the use cases, especially the use cases that people are struggling to get good results out of? And then comparing that to the current state of taxonomies and what you get from user surveys and search logs. Those things would be the main elements of a business case for doing this, because you have challenges with findability. The volume of content and the number of people involved makes it economically worth it, and it's worth giving it a try. So once you've decided on that, then there's a business requirements and pre-work phase, scenarios for how it will be used, getting into your main taxonomy facets and how people would use them, and specific search functionality that you might want to highlight, like that policies and procedures search we talked about earlier. So all of that gives good context for setting up both the taxonomy development and the classification. Then you're into technology selection. As we mentioned, there's probably 4 or 5 strong players in this market today in terms of auto classification. Others are coming along, but you'll want to do a good review of which one makes most sense to you. And then you're into the implementation and testing on the lines we talked about earlier, the taxonomy, the rules, and the testing of those rules. And you need to plan probably for about 6 months for a large or even a medium to large enterprise to get all that done, just because of all the cycles you have to go through and the work required both in preparing the taxonomy and preparing the rules. And then think about the governance, as we mentioned. Think about that early on, make sure that you have the business buy-in for that and that you're going to be able to sustain it over time. So that's what we had. I hope that's given you a good picture of both why this might be worthwhile for your organization and how to do it and what to expect along the way in terms of opportunities and challenges. So it does require investment and organizational commitment, but we believe it's worth the challenge. The challenges can be overcome, and there are many proof points for why this would be helpful and useful for the organization and why it helps tackle that challenge of content overload and findability. And as you saw, there are huge benefits for getting it right, not only for the users, but also for the KM professionals in terms of their ability to curate better, to manage classification better, and overall to improve the quality of your whole knowledge management infrastructure. So I hope it's been helpful. That's what we had for today, and thank you for listening.
And thank you so much, Simon and Bob. And on behalf of APQC, we thank I Know LLC for your support and your participation in this webinar. And for the rest of you, thank you so much for joining, and we hope to see you next month on the next call. Thank you, and have a great day.